Imagine you're walking down the cobblestone streets of Rome, back in 67 AD. The sun is beating down, merchants are hawking their wares, and then you see something that stops you dead in your tracks. There's Emperor Nero himself, strolling through the forum like he owns the place, which, let's be honest, he basically does. But here's the thing that would make your blood run cold. Walking beside him is this absolutely gorgeous woman, dripping in silk and jewels, looking every bit the part of a Roman empress. But if you listen closely to the whispers echoing off those ancient walls, you'd hear the most disturbing truth. That stunning woman? She used to be a teenage boy named Sporus. And what Nero did to transform him represents one of the most twisted, horrifying examples of abuse and manipulation in all of recorded history. Now, before we dive headfirst into this absolutely insane story from ancient Rome, I got to ask, if you're into these kinds of deep dives into history's darkest corners, do me a solid and smash the like button. And hey, definitely subscribe because I've got tons more content like this coming your way. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'm always blown away by the fact that we're all here, scattered across the globe, diving into these ancient stories together. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. What you're about to hear isn't just another wild tale of Roman excess and debauchery. This is the story of how having unlimited power can twist love into something sick and obsessive, how grief can literally drive someone insane, and how a human being can be turned into nothing more than a living, breathing doll designed to fulfill one man's completely unhinged fantasy. The name Sporus probably doesn't ring any bells for you, but trust me, once you hear his story, it's going to stick with you for a long, long time. So let's talk about the man who orchestrated this whole nightmare, Emperor Nero. Here's the thing that's really messed up. Nero wasn't some cartoon villain who was born evil. When he first grabbed power at the ripe old age of 16, people were actually pretty pumped about it. They thought they were witnessing the start of some kind of golden age. And honestly, early on, Nero was doing some pretty solid emperor stuff. He cut taxes, which obviously made people happy. He funded public entertainment, gladiator fights, chariot races, all that good stuff that Romans went crazy for. He even got up on stage and performed in theatrical productions, which the common people absolutely loved, even if it made the stuffy aristocrats roll their eyes. But here's the thing about absolute power. It has this nasty habit of corrupting even the most promising people. And by 65 AD, something had fundamentally snapped inside Nero's brain. Maybe it was the constant paranoia that comes with knowing literally everyone around you wants your job and would probably kill you to get it. Maybe it was the crushing isolation of being the only person in an empire of 60 million people who could never be told no, never be challenged, never be contradicted. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person he claimed to love more than life itself. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything Nero thought he wanted in a woman. We're talking drop-dead gorgeous, smart enough to keep up with his massive ego, and ambitious enough to share his completely over-the-top dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just another pretty face floating around the imperial court. This woman had razor-sharp political instincts that made her either your best ally or your worst nightmare. When Nero first laid eyes on Poppaea, he was already married to Octavia, who was the daughter of the previous emperor. But that marriage was basically a business arrangement, cold, loveless, and purely political. Poppaea represented everything that Octavia wasn't. Where Octavia was quiet and tried to stay out of everyone's way, Poppaea was vivacious and commanded attention wherever she went. Where Octavia actively avoided being the center of attention, Poppaea practically lived for having all eyes on her. The affair between Nero and Poppaea started like most Roman scandals do, with adultery and political maneuvering. But what began as your typical imperial affair quickly spiraled into something way more dangerous. Genuine, obsessive, all-consuming love. Or at least, what Nero thought was love. See, Nero wasn't just attracted to Poppaea's beauty. He was completely consumed by her in a way that terrified even his closest advisors. Ancient historians describe Nero during this period as becoming increasingly unhinged and possessive. If other men so much as looked at Poppaea for too long during public functions, Nero would fly into these absolutely murderous rages. He started stationing guard around her 24/7, supposedly for her protection, but really to monitor every single interaction she had with anyone. He showered her with gifts that literally bankrupted the imperial treasury. We're talking jewels from India, silk from China, perfumes from Arabia, the works. But the most telling thing? He started reshaping reality itself to accommodate his obsession with her. First, he divorced Octavia, which was a shocking move that alienated a bunch of his supporters. Then he announced he was going to marry Poppaea in a full imperial ceremony. The wedding was this absolutely insane spectacle of luxury, with Nero sparing no expense to show everyone just how devoted he was to this woman. But even being married to her wasn't enough to satisfy Nero's need to completely possess Poppaea. He started isolating her from her family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed their positions entirely to his favor. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures of her, not just for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could stare at her image even when they were apart. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would sometimes spend literal hours just watching Poppaea as she went about her daily activities. And let me be clear, this wasn't romantic devotion. This was the behavior of someone who had completely confused love with ownership, who saw another human being not as an independent person, but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Now, Poppaea wasn't stupid. She was smart enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her unprecedented power in the imperial court. But she was also shrewd enough to realize that this power came with enormous risks. She started using her influence to advance her family's interests, building this network of supporters who would protect her if Nero's affections ever started to waver. But here's where Poppaea made a fatal mistake. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike literally everyone else in the imperial court, who had learned to read the emperor's moods and never, ever contradict him, Poppaea kept her independence. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his performances when she thought they sucked. And that brings us to the day that changed everything. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary, depending on which ancient historian you're reading, but the outcome was always the same. During what started as just another typical domestic argument, some sources say it was about Nero coming home late from chariot races. Others say it was about his theatrical pursuits. The emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea had the audacity to criticize Nero's priorities. She suggested that he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband and father. Now, here's the kicker. She was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child. Maybe the stress of pregnancy made her less willing to put up with Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. What happened next has been debated by historians for literally centuries, but the consensus is that Nero, in a fit of absolute rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. Some sources say it was a single blow to her abdomen. Others describe a sustained attack that left her bleeding and unconscious on the marble floor of their palace. Just imagine that moment when Nero realized what he had done. Here's a man who commanded 30 legions, who could have literally anyone executed with just a word, who was worshipped as a god in some eastern provinces. And he had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The woman he had been obsessed with was dying because of his own uncontrolled violence. Ancient sources describe what followed as one of the most pathetic scenes in imperial history. Nero reportedly threw himself on Poppaea's body, alternating between begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority could somehow extend over death itself. He summoned the best physicians in Rome, offering them absolute fortunes to save her life, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Nero's heir. And in that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. The grief that followed wasn't just emotional devastation. It was a complete break from reality. Nero's mourning became the stuff of legend. He refused to have Poppeia's body burned according to traditional Roman custom. Instead, he had it embalmed and placed in a tomb that was more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, established an actual cult in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had to navigate an even more dangerous landscape. Courtiers were expected to participate in this fiction that Poppaea was somehow still alive. They had to refer to her in the present tense and leave her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested that maybe, just maybe, the emperor should move on was immediately exiled or worse. And it was during this period of complete psychological breakdown that Sporus first entered Nero's line of sight. The young man had absolutely no idea he was about to walk into a living nightmare. So let's talk about Sporus. This kid was probably around 14 or 15 years old when he first caught Nero's attention. He'd been born into slavery in the imperial household, but had been freed as a child, which, believe it or not, was actually a pretty good deal in ancient Rome. He'd been raised within the palace walls, getting the kind of education that would prepare him for administrative duties. Now, this might sound like a privileged position, and in many ways it was. Freedmen who worked in imperial service often had better living conditions than freeborn citizens from lower classes. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This privilege came with complete and total dependence on imperial favor. These freedmen owed literally everything to their former master's generosity, which created this situation of absolute vulnerability. They could be elevated to positions of great influence one day, but they could also be discarded, punished, or straight up killed on a whim, with absolutely no legal recourse. They had no rights, no protection, no way to say no when the emperor wanted something from them. Now, what made Sporus special in Nero's eyes wasn't his intelligence or his skills or his potential. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agree on this. The young man bore an absolutely uncanny resemblance to the dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and in his delicate bone structure. And in a world where Romans believed that physical resemblance indicated some kind of deeper spiritual connection, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. Picture this: Nero, still completely unhinged with grief, wandering around his palace talking to corpses and maintaining elaborate fantasies about his dead wife. And then he sees this kid, this teenage boy who looks so much like Poppaea that for a split second, Nero probably thought he was seeing her ghost. The first time Nero laid eyes on Sporus after Poppaea's death, something just clicked in the emperor's completely broken mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he had destroyed through his own violence. The resemblance was so striking that Nero may have actually convinced himself he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one pretty obvious problem with this fantasy. Sporus was male, but for a man who had convinced himself he was a god, who had spent months having conversations with a dead body, changing someone's gender probably seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculated, cold-blooded acts of cruelty in all of human history. Nero didn't just decide to make Sporus dress up like a woman for some twisted game. He decided to make the transformation permanent and irreversible. The emperor summoned the best physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on this young man. Surgery that had one purpose and one purpose only: to make him appear more feminine. Let me be crystal clear about what we're talking about here. This wasn't just mutilation. This was the systematic destruction of Sporus's identity as a human being. The procedure was incredibly dangerous, unbelievably painful, and completely irreversible. In ancient Rome, this kind of surgery often resulted in death from infection or blood loss. But even if Sporus survived, and that was a big if, he would be forever changed. Not just physically, but emotionally and socially. He would never be able to father children, never experience normal relationships, never even be considered fully male by Roman society. The surgery took place right there in the imperial palace, in quarters that had been specifically prepared for this purpose. Remember, ancient surgical procedures were primitive as hell. They were relying on basic instruments and crude anesthetics. The process would have been absolutely excruciating, lasting for hours with a significant risk of death at every moment. Can you imagine what was going through Sporus's mind as this was happening? He would have been held down by guards while physicians approached with their instruments, knowing that his screams would fall on completely deaf ears. This wasn't a medical procedure. This was torture designed to satisfy one man's twisted fantasy. Once Sporus recovered, and we're talking about a process that took weeks or months, Nero made an announcement that shocked even the most jaded Roman aristocrats. He was going to marry this young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony. Let that sink in for a second. The Emperor of Rome was planning to marry a surgically modified teenage boy and pretend he was his dead wife. The preparations for this wedding took months and consumed absolutely enormous resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to special quarters where he could be prepared for his new role. Imperial seamstresses worked around the clock, creating an entire wardrobe for him, designing gowns that would flatter his modified physique and hide any remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him. And here's the really twisted part. Many of these pieces incorporated gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't just accessories. They were tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace. The transformation wasn't just physical. It was psychological torture on an unimaginable scale. Makeup artists taught him cosmetic techniques to feminize his features. They showed him how to use kohl to make his eyes appear larger, how to apply rouge to create rosy cheeks, how to use powders to soften his facial angles. But these weren't just beauty lessons. They were exercises in the systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers instructed him in the elaborate styling techniques that were fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was cut, curled, and arranged in these complex patterns, often incorporating expensive ornaments. The process could take hours every single day, requiring multiple servants and heated metal tools. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging part of this whole nightmare were the lessons in feminine behavior and deportment. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in appropriately ladle-like ways. He had to learn how to hold his hands, how to position his feet, how to arrange his clothing when he sat down, how to move through space in a way that conveyed grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt the linguistic mannerisms associated with feminine discourse. This was probably the most challenging aspect of the whole transformation, because vocal patterns are so deeply ingrained and incredibly difficult to change consciously. Just try to imagine the psychological torture of this entire process. Every single day, Sporus was forced to look in mirrors that reflected back a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior was a reminder that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman was now a shackle, binding him to a role he had never chosen. Can you picture what was going through this kid's mind? He was probably wondering if he was going insane, if this was all some kind of nightmare he'd eventually wake up from. But every morning, he'd wake up in those same quarters, surrounded by the same people, forced to continue this grotesque performance. The wedding was scheduled for spring of 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight to the occasion. Nero spared absolutely no expense, treating this as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs while servants offered the finest wines and delicacies money could buy. To outside observers who didn't know the full story, it might have looked like a normal imperial wedding. But everyone who was in the know understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply disturbing. Here was the most powerful man in the world, publicly marrying a surgically modified teenage boy who had been dressed up as his dead wife. The ceremony included all the traditional Roman wedding rituals. They exchanged vows, joined hands, shared sacred bread, and signed legal documents that made this union official in the eyes of Roman law. The guests played their parts with the kind of accomplished acting skills that come from years of surviving in the imperial court, offering congratulations and expensive gifts while maintaining expressions of appropriate joy. But you have to imagine the atmosphere in that room. It must have been thick with barely concealed horror, fascination, and that nervous energy that comes from participating in something you know is fundamentally wrong. Following the wedding, Nero treated Sporus exactly as he would have treated a legitimate empress. The young man received his own household staff, his own quarters within the palace complex, and his own income from the imperial treasury. He had his own litter for traveling, his own horses for riding, and his own retinue of supporters. But all of this apparent luxury came with a terrible, terrible price. The complete erasure of his original identity and the constant performance of a psychologically devastating role. Sporus was expected to accompany Nero to public functions, to sit beside him at state dinners, and to play the devoted wife in all their interactions. And here's the really messed up part. This wasn't just about keeping up appearances. Nero genuinely seemed to believe that he had successfully resurrected Poppaea from the dead. He would call Sporus by his dead wife's name, reminisce about shared memories that had never actually happened, and expect responses that maintained this elaborate fiction. For Sporus, every single day became a high-stakes performance where the slightest mistake could literally mean death. He had to remember not just how to look and act like a woman, but how to respond as if he were Poppaea herself. When Nero mentioned events from his previous marriage, Sporus had to react as if he remembered them personally. When Nero talked about their shared experiences, Sporus had to play along as if those memories were his own. Ancient sources describe Sporus as becoming increasingly skilled at this deception, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Nero's moods and respond appropriately. But they also note that he grew more and more withdrawn and melancholic as time passed, even though he continued to play his assigned role perfectly in public. The psychological strain is almost impossible to imagine. Every morning, Sporus woke up in rooms that had been decorated to remind him of a dead woman he had never actually met. Every reflection in every mirror showed him a face that bore no resemblance to his original appearance. Every conversation required him to pretend to be someone else, to claim memories and experiences that weren't his own. For over 2 years, Sporus lived this completely bizarre existence. But his ordeal reached new heights of insanity when Nero decided to take a grand tour of Greece. The emperor fancied himself an artist and was eager to compete in Greek festivals where he believed his talents would be properly appreciated by people who understood true culture. Naturally, Sporus accompanied him on this trip, displayed to foreign dignitaries as the Empress of Rome. Just imagine these Greek aristocrats trying to make sense of their Roman conqueror, traveling with a teenage boy dressed as a woman, demanding that everyone treat this obvious fiction as reality. So by 68 AD, Nero's completely unhinged behavior had finally pushed the Roman establishment past their breaking point. We're talking about rebellions breaking out all across the empire, led by governors who were absolutely sick and tired of the emperor's erratic behavior and his complete neglect of actually running the damn empire. The Praetorian Guard, basically Nero's personal bodyguards and the most elite military unit in Rome, declared their opposition to his continued rule. When your own bodyguards turn against you, you know you're in serious trouble. The Senate condemned him as an enemy of the state, which in Roman terms was basically a death sentence with extra steps. When Nero finally realized that his reign was over and he had to get the hell out of Rome before someone put a sword through his chest, guess who was among the small group of supporters who fled with him? That's right, Sporus. Even when facing death, the emperor couldn't leave behind his living reminder of Poppaea. They ended up holed up in this villa outside Rome, basically waiting for either some kind of miraculous rescue or inevitable capture. While they're hiding out, Nero's alternating between these grandiose escape plans, like fleeing to Egypt where he still had supporters, And these theatrical preparations for suicide, because of course he was going to make his death as dramatic as possible. When word finally came that their enemies were closing in and there was no way out, Nero chose death over capture. But here's the thing. His suicide left Sporus in an incredibly vulnerable position. He was one of the most visible symbols of Nero's reign, which made him both a valuable prize and a dangerous liability for whoever claimed power next. What followed was perhaps even more tragic than what he'd already endured. Sporus became like a political pawn, passed from one powerful man to another like he was valuable property instead of a human being. First, he was claimed by Nymphidius Sabinus, one of the Praetorian commanders who had helped orchestrate Nero's downfall. Then he was passed to Otho, who became emperor after a brief civil war. Then he ended up with Vitellius, who took power after defeating Otho. And here's the really messed up part. Each of these men treated him pretty much exactly like Nero had. They kept him dressed as a woman, they called him by Poppaea's name, and they used him as this bizarre trophy to legitimize their own power. Think about what this means for Sporus. He's gone from one nightmare directly into another, and then another. Every time he might have hoped that his ordeal was finally over, some new powerful man would claim him and force him to continue this grotesque performance. It was under Vitellius that Sporus's nightmare reached its absolute rock bottom. The new emperor decided to use him for public entertainment in the Colosseum, specifically in a reenactment of mythological scenes that involve violence and sexual humiliation. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant. The Colosseum wasn't just about gladiators fighting wild animals. Romans also staged elaborate theatrical productions that often involved real violence and real sexual assault, performed in front of thousands of cheering spectators. These weren't actors playing roles. These were real people, usually slaves or prisoners, being forced to act out mythological stories that ended with their actual deaths or sexual degradation. For Sporus, this represented the ultimate degradation. After years of being forced to play the role of a dead woman, after being surgically mutilated and psychologically tortured, he was now going to be sexually humiliated in front of thousands of people for their entertainment. But here's where Sporus finally took back some control over his own fate. Rather than submit to this final humiliation, he made the only choice that was truly his own in years. He took his own life, probably by poison, sometime in 69 AD. He was probably no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus finally escaped the grotesque theater that had consumed his entire adult life. His story became this cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the human cost of imperial excess. But here's what really gets me. Ancient historians seemed way more interested in Sporus as a symbol of imperial decadence than as an actual person who had suffered unimaginable abuse. What makes his story so haunting isn't just the horrific abuse he endured, but how he was systematically stripped of his identity and agency. From the moment Nero decided he resembled Poppaea, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual human being. He became nothing more than a canvas for the emperor's completely twisted fantasies. The fact that Sporus chose death over further humiliation tells us something really important. It suggests that somewhere, buried beneath all those layers of forced femininity and imperial conditioning, some spark of his original self had survived. His suicide was both a tragedy and a final act of defiance, a refusal to be degraded any further, even if it cost him his life. And here's perhaps the most tragic part of this whole story. We know almost nothing about who Sporus actually was before his transformation. What were his hopes and dreams? What did he want to do with his life? Did he have friends, hobbies, ambitions? All of that was completely erased when he became Nero's living doll, replaced by a performance that was so complete his original identity disappeared entirely. This is what makes the story so deeply disturbing. It's not just about the physical and sexual abuse, though that's horrific enough. It's about the complete annihilation of a person's sense of self. Sporus was forced to live as someone else for years, to claim memories that weren't his, to respond to a name that wasn't his, to inhabit a body that had been surgically altered to satisfy someone else's fantasy. Every morning he woke up and had to put on this performance. knowing that the slightest slip could mean death. Every conversation required him to pretend to be a dead woman he'd never met. Every mirror reflection showed him a stranger's face. The psychological torture of that existence is almost impossible to comprehend. But you know what? In the end, Sporus found a way to reclaim his agency. By choosing his own death, he finally took back the one thing that had been denied to him throughout his adult life: the power to make his own choice about his fate. It's a heartbreaking choice, but it was his choice. His story serves as this powerful reminder that behind every grand narrative of imperial power and Roman glory, there are individual human stories of suffering and survival that deserve our attention and our compassion, even across this vast gulf of 2,000 years. When we read about ancient Rome, it's easy to get caught up in the spectacle of it all: the conquest, the architecture, the political drama. But stories like Sporus's remind us that for every emperor living in luxury, there were countless individuals whose lives were destroyed to satisfy the whims of the powerful. The boy who was forced to become an empress, who endured years of psychological and physical abuse, who finally chose death over further degradation. His story deserves to be remembered not just as some weird curiosity from ancient Rome, but as a testament to both human cruelty and human resilience. And maybe that's the most important lesson we can take from this absolutely horrific story. Power without accountability, without limits, without compassion, inevitably leads to the dehumanization of the vulnerable. Sporus' story is extreme, but the underlying dynamics, the powerful exploiting the powerless, the erasure of individual identity to serve someone else's fantasy, the complete disregard for human dignity, these patterns show up throughout history. We see echoes of it in slavery, in human trafficking, in any system where some people are treated as property rather than as human beings with their own rights and dignity. Sporus' story is a reminder that we need to be vigilant about protecting the vulnerable, about placing limits on power, and about remembering that every person, no matter how powerless they might seem, deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. In choosing death over further humiliation, Sporus made a statement about his own worth as a human being. He refused to be reduced to nothing more than an object for someone else's pleasure. And in that final act of defiance, he reclaimed his humanity in the only way available to him. Third, that resistance takes many forms, and sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to be broken. But perhaps most importantly, we learn that we have a responsibility to protect the vulnerable in our own societies. We can't prevent every tragedy, but we can work to build systems that limit the abuse of power and protect those who can't protect themselves. We can speak out against injustice when we see it. We can support organizations that work to protect vulnerable populations. We can vote for leaders who demonstrate compassion and accountability. We can teach our children about the importance of human dignity and the dangers of unchecked power. And we can remember stories like Sporus's, not just as historical curiosities, but as reminders of what happens when we fail to protect the vulnerable. His story is a warning from the past about the kind of world we create when we allow power to go unchecked and when we treat some people as less than human. But it's also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest circumstances, even when everything seems hopeless, people find ways to maintain their dignity and assert their worth. Sporus' final choice was tragic, but it was also a powerful statement about the value of human life and the importance of individual agency. In the end, that's what makes his story so compelling and so important. It's not just about the abuse he suffered, though that's certainly part of it. It's about the fact that he never completely surrendered his humanity, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. So the next time you hear about abuses of power in our own world, whether it's human trafficking or sexual exploitation or any other form of treating people as objects rather than human beings, remember Sporus. Remember that behind every statistic is an individual person with their own story, their own dignity, their own inherent worth. And remember that we all have a responsibility to speak up for those who can't speak for themselves, to protect the vulnerable, and to ensure that the kinds of horrors that destroyed Sporus' life never happen again. That's his legacy, not just a victim of imperial cruelty, but a reminder of the importance of human dignity and the power of individual resistance. And that's a legacy worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth carrying forward into our own time. Thanks for sticking with me through this incredibly dark but important story. If you found it thought-provoking, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most compelling and significant stories. And let me know in the comments, what lessons do you think we can learn from Sporus' story that apply to our world today? Now, I want to take a step back and talk about why this story matters beyond just being this shocking tale from ancient Rome. Because when you really think about it, Sporus' story isn't just about one emperor's twisted obsession. It's about what happens when human beings are treated as objects rather than people. See, the Romans had this whole system built around the idea that some people were basically property. Slaves, freedmen, even women in many cases, they existed to serve the needs and desires of powerful men. But Sporus' case takes this to an absolutely extreme level. He wasn't just owned by Nero. He was literally remade in the image of someone else, forced to become a living monument to the emperor's grief and guilt. And here's what really gets me. This kind of thing didn't end with the Roman Empire. Throughout history, we see powerful people treating others as objects to be shaped according to their desires. It happens in different forms, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Those with power imposing their will on those without it, regardless of the human cost. Think about it. We see it in the history of slavery, where people were bought and sold like cattle, their identities erased, their families destroyed, their bodies used however their owners saw fit. We see it in human trafficking today, where vulnerable people are forced into situations where they have no agency, no choice, no way to say no to whatever's demanded of them. We see it in systems of arranged marriage where young people, especially young women, are treated as bargaining chips in political or economic negotiations, their own desires and identities completely irrelevant to the people making decisions about their lives. The specific details change, but the pattern remains the same. Powerful people treating vulnerable people as objects to be manipulated, shaped, and used according to their whims. But here's what makes Sporus' story particularly haunting. It's not just about physical abuse or even sexual abuse, though those elements are certainly there. It's about the complete erasure of identity. Sporus was forced to become someone else so completely that his original self practically disappeared from history. We don't know what his hopes and dreams were. We don't know what he was passionate about, what made him laugh, what he feared, what he loved. All of that was swept away when Nero decided he looked like Poppaea. From that moment on, Sporus existed only as a reflection of someone else's desires and fantasies. And that's a kind of violence that goes beyond the physical. It's psychological murder, the killing of someone's sense of self, their identity, their understanding of who they are as a person. In some ways, it's worse than physical death because the person continues to exist, but they're forced to live as someone else. This is why Sporus' final choice is so significant. By choosing death, he was making a statement about his own worth as a human being. He was saying, I would rather die as myself than continue living as someone else. In a world where he had been denied every other form of agency, suicide became his only way to assert his own identity and dignity. It's a tragic choice, but it's also a profoundly human one. Throughout history, people in impossible situations have chosen death over continued degradation. It's never a choice we want anyone to have to make, but sometimes it's the only way to maintain some sense of self-worth and humanity. And that brings me to something I think is really important to understand about this story. When we talk about historical figures like Nero, it's easy to dismiss them as monsters who were completely different from us. But the truth is the capacity for this kind of cruelty exists in all of us when we have unchecked power and no accountability. Nero wasn't born evil. He started out as a teenager who seemed to have genuine potential as a leader. But absolute power, combined with trauma and grief, transformed him into someone capable of unimaginable cruelty. The lesson here isn't that Nero was uniquely evil. It's that power without limits and without accountability inevitably corrupts. This is why democratic institutions matter. This is why checks and balances matter. This is why we need systems that protect the vulnerable and place limits on what those in power can do. Because history shows us over and over again that when people have unlimited power over others, they will use it in ways that cause enormous suffering. The Romans themselves understood this, which is why they originally set up the Republic with all these complicated systems designed to prevent any one person from gaining too much power. But by Nero's time, those systems had broken down, and the result was exactly what you'd expect: a series of emperors who treated their subjects as playthings rather than people. But there's another lesson here that I think is equally important. Even in the most extreme circumstances, people find ways to maintain their humanity and dignity. Sporus endured years of unimaginable abuse, but he never completely lost his sense of self. When faced with the ultimate degradation, he chose to die rather than submit. That choice took incredible courage. It would have been easier to just go along with what was demanded of him, to continue the performance and hope that maybe things would get better. But instead, he made the hardest choice possible. He chose his own death over continued humiliation. And in making that choice, he sent a message that echoes across the centuries. Every human being has inherent worth and dignity that cannot be taken away, no matter how powerless they might seem. Even when everything else is stripped away, freedom, identity, agency, the core of human dignity remains. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not romanticizing suicide or suggesting it's ever the right choice. In the modern world, we have resources and support systems that didn't exist in ancient Rome. We have therapists, support groups, legal protections, and social safety nets that can help people in desperate situations. But Sporus didn't have any of those things. He lived in a world where he had no legal rights, no way to escape, no one to turn to for help. In that context, his choice becomes not just understandable, but a kind of heroic act of self-determination. It's also worth noting that Sporus' story has been told and retold throughout history, which means that in some sense, his original identity has been preserved. We may not know much about who he was before Nero transformed him, but we know that he existed, that he suffered, and that he ultimately chose dignity over degradation. This brings me to why I think it's so important to tell stories like this. It's not just about shocking people with tales of ancient cruelty, though this story is certainly shocking. It's about remembering the individuals who suffered and died in the shadows of great historical events. When we read about the Roman Empire, we usually focus on the emperors, the generals, the politicians, the people who wielded power and made decisions that affected millions of lives. But for every emperor, there were countless people like Sporus whose lives were destroyed to satisfy the whims of the powerful. These stories matter because they remind us that history isn't just about the grand sweep of political events. It's about individual human beings, each with their own hopes, fears, dreams, and dignity. And when we forget that, when we start thinking of people as statistics or objects or tools to be used, we open the door to the kind of cruelty that destroyed Sporus' life. There's also something to be said about the power of storytelling itself. The fact that we're still talking about Sporus 2,000 years later means that his story has outlived the empire that created it. Nero is remembered primarily as a tyrant and a monster. The Roman Empire eventually fell. But Sporus' story of suffering and resistance continues to resonate. That's the power of bearing witness to injustice. When we tell these stories, when we remember the victims and not just the victors, we help ensure that their suffering wasn't meaningless. We turn individual tragedy into collective memory, and collective memory into wisdom about how to build better societies. And that's something we desperately need in our own time. We live in a world where power imbalances still exist, where vulnerable people are still exploited, where human dignity is still under threat. The specific forms of abuse may have changed, but the underlying dynamics remain the same. So what can we learn from Sporus' story? First, that unchecked power inevitably leads to the abuse of the vulnerable. Second, that every human being has inherent dignity that cannot be taken away, no matter how powerless they might seem.